I've learned things that I didn't know from my partners where they're like, hey, you're shipping things in cartons that are 2% larger than the volumetric threshold. If you had a slightly smaller carton, you'd save a lot of money. And I was like, man, we should have thought of that. I remember that from my early years, and I never let that go after that. I was like, we're going to always check for that, make sure that that's part of our internal audit. So that's another thing too, where almost everywhere I've been, we go to standardized cartons and we have our partners certify them so that they know, like if there's a overbilling, we know to a certainty because we know which carton it was that, hey, that's not oversized. We know how much that's supposed to cost. Don't charge me more for it.
Welcome to Parcel Perspectives, the podcast dedicated to small parcel shippers. I'm Glenn Gooding, and each episode, we dive into insights, best practices, and strategies to help you navigate this complex, costly market.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Parcel Perspectives. I'm Glenn Gooding. Today, we're joined by Jamin Dick, CEO and founder of J.Dick Advisory and former Chief Supply Chain Officer for Land's End. He really brings a wealth of knowledge in supply chain and logistics experience. Today, we're going to explore how recent changes by key players like UPS, Amazon, and USPS are reshaping the landscape of e-commerce shipping. 2025 is really proving to be a very dynamic environment. We'll dive into strategic adaptations that businesses can employ to not just survive, but thrive in these fundamental and turbulent times. Jamin, welcome to Parcel Perspectives.
Thanks, Glenn. It's great to be here.
Great. Thanks for being here. You mind telling us just a little bit more about your background?
I've been in the e-commerce retail space really for the last 25 years, which I guess puts me back to kind of the beginning of when e-commerce was starting to happen. I joined IBM in the late 90s and started to work with a lot of brands and retailers that were launching their first e-commerce platforms. Target being one of them. Eventually, I went to Target and helped them grow the Target.com business. And then Alibaba for a while, also helping them grow their business. And then most recently, Land's End. So really kind of an e-commerce retailer since the beginning.
So you've been in the thick of it. I think with 25 years, I think we both qualify as being in the old guys club.
I think that officially, yeah, that happened a little while ago for me.
Yeah, me too. I hate to cede that ground, but I think it's time. So let's dive in. I mentioned 2025 has been turbulent and dynamic. I'll lay it out there for you. I think, UPS, if you look at their latest shareholder, report, they're struggling. They're losing market share. They've hit some headwinds. We have Amazon Logistics making great strides in the small parcel final mile sector. We have USPS doing some things too with delivering for America. What kind of perspective do you have on these recent changes in the marketplace?
I think it's a really interesting time, especially if you're on the retail side or just on the buyer side of the small parcel space. I will say that most of my career, it's been a bit of a seller's market when it comes to small parcel services. And I think that's really shifting. And that a couple things driving that. Number one is just generally, the small parcel growth is going to be a lot slower than it was in the past. So I think the projections that we've seen are something around 5% over the next 8 to 9 years, CAGR. That's pretty modest. So the pie isn't growing as fast as it was before. And you combine that with people like Amazon jumping in now, in a short amount of time, built a network that rivals UPS's, and actually they're moving more boxes than UPS or FedEx now, end to end. And so now you've got a pretty competitive market. It really feels like we're looking at a prolonged buyer's market. I hate to be too optimistic about it, but if I was a brand or retailer right now, I'd be thinking this is an area for me to really see if I can get my prices down.
So seller's market to a buyer's market. I tend to agree. However, that's quite a ball of yarn to unwind as well, wouldn't you think?
Absolutely. Yeah. And to capture the value of that, you're going to have to negotiate carefully. I think you'll have to have a network of your own that supports capturing savings. And then I think there's a technology component as well. And many people are in longer term contracts. So you just can't jump out of that. Although I do have a perspective on that, how to deal with being in a long term contract you're not happy with. But I do think you just can't instantly get the value of the market shift. But I think getting in formation to do that is really important.
You'd mentioned technology. I don't want to take too deep a dive down that rabbit hole with you, but I think it's an important thing to call out. I'm assuming you're meaning you need to be able to execute in this environment. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, that's right. And nobody just depends on the carrier alone, right? Obviously, you're in an e-commerce world, especially. How well can you convey the value of your shipping to your customer? Is it, if you have a great carrier with great pricing, do you also have the ability to let your customer know that and to give them visibility to their parcel, communicate well? If you don't do all of that, it sort of doesn't help you out just to have a great carrier. And I've been at a lot of places where you just have to invest in that technology for a while and in order to really reap the benefits of a buyer's market.
If we just roll kind of another of the national carriers in the mix, we should say, I don't want to just pick on UPS here by any means. It's UPS and FedEx were the kind of the traditional duopoly in the national small parcel space. And what one did, the other likely followed suit with shortly thereafter. And you mentioned kind of unwinding yourself from a existing commitment, a carrier contract, if you will. What were you seeing from your seat as you kind of going through the evolution of e-commerce?
The experience, I'm sure this is something everyone in my seat has experienced. You get the two big guys in there. Maybe you bring USPS as well. You do a three-way RFP, and you land on FedEx or UPS, and then they sign you up for a 5-year contract or something, or 4 years, and if you're lucky. And so people get locked into these things, and they sort of are like, oh, I guess I can't do anything. And the reality is, there are things you can do. And one thing that's important is to let them know, hey, the market's changing. I care about giving my customers the best service, and I'm going to do that. Let's say you have a minimum commitment. Rate shop down to one parcel above that minimum commitment, right? And if that volume goes away, people will start to see, oh, they're serious about this. And most of these guys will come back, especially in a deflationary market from a volume perspective where they're fighting for market share. They're going to come back to the table, and I think that's a very important thing. So 2-year contract, 3-year, 5-year, whatever, the market still is still the boss here. And you need to have a continual sort of ongoing dialogue with your partners and say, look, I expect you to bring me market competitive rates and great service all the time. We may need to rethink this contract and give them a shot at it.
You bet. Is it fair to also assume with kind of some of the changes, let's say USPS Delivering for America, kind of their position with the workshare program? So if we're thinking e-commerce, we're talking about sub-pound type of environment. Where do you go with that in today's environment? What are your options? That's
probably the area that's changing maybe the most, because with the USPS reform that's underway now, a couple of interesting things there, right? They're redoing their network. So they're pulling consolidation further up in the network. There's a slow breakup happening as well between UPS, FedEx, and USPS, right? So they're starting to pull apart on that. And then there's a mandate for the USPS to not lose as much money. And so they got to bring their pricing up and be a little more competitive. That's very interesting. So, if I was running USPS, I'd be that's a tall order, right? I mean, that's a lot for them to figure out. Some of their services are running at 83% on time, which is not competitive. That is not enough in e-commerce.
I would agree.
They're going to have to substantially improve that. And so all of that to say, you have to think through, if I'm going to just go for price here, I'm going to end up in a network that's very much under an evolution. at USPS, and I may have to think about, depending on how important it is to have on-time delivery, I may have to pay a little bit more. And, with my partners at UPS, FedEx, whatever, and some of the other work share companies out there. I just think there's a lot of change because of the change that's happening in that sector specifically. I'm sort of taking a wait and see on that. I want to see, can they actually pull this off?
My reason for bringing that wrinkle up, Jamin, is as I think about this, when you think about UPS or FedEx, traditionally, from a legacy perspective, they go in and they negotiate with you. They want everything, right? And they're happy to give you what they think are the market leading rates for everything. Well, today, given some of the challenges they have, this breakup with USPS and the final mile solution, whether it be through consolidators or through UPS SurePost or some of these other things, I guess the fundamental question becomes in 2025, does it make sense? Does UPS or does FedEx truly want everything?
I don't think they do actually anymore. I think UPS in particular has been very clear. Carol Tomei has been very clear about this, that they're still leading in revenue, even though they don't have the most volume anymore. And they're deliberately selecting more high profit business. And so they're clearly willing to compete for the piece they want and leave some of the rest of it on the table, which is a shift. That's different. It used to be, I'm only going to give you the best UPS ground rate if you're also using Mail Innovations. And like, those are very different businesses. So it didn't make a lot of sense. Plus the discount wasn't really that impressive for doing that. And what I've always said is, how do you know if I give everything to, let's just say UPS, I give them everything, and I have sub 1 pound all the way up to, let's say, 10 pounds. How do I know that I'm getting the best deal? The only way to know that, if I'm rate shopping actively. And so why would I commit to that in a contract? I need, let them compete for the piece that they're good at. And then have some flexibility. You don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. I think we none of us do. And I like the idea of being able to give them the part they're good at. Somebody else is better at the small stuff or the big stuff, and they get that. That's my personal preference. And I think that aligns with what UPS is doing as well, where they're saying, we're better at this range here. We're going to not compete too hard on the really small stuff.
We need technology, obviously, to be able to effectively rate shop in an environment. If we're looking to modify those existing long-term legacy agreements with one of the national carriers, we need to be armed with some intelligence and really collaborate with the carrier at this point and say, what makes sense in your world today? What do you want, right? And then aligning accordingly. What do you think, you go through that exercise in today's market? So you said it's kind of a buyer's market, but we're dealing with a lot of headwinds as well as far as costs. What are the immediate and long-term impacts of some of these maneuvers on shipping costs and logistics? And I know your crystal ball is no better than my crystal ball. We don't have a way of looking, but
I tend to be a bit of an optimist on some of this stuff, but because I do think competition is good for buyers. And what we're seeing is more competition. We're seeing the market become less distorted than I think it was at one point. USPS was a distortion because they're losing money. They've been losing money for a long time. And now they've been told, don't lose money anymore. And so there's a huge portion of US parcel volume that needs to get in line with competitive rates. And so in the short term, I think, it's going to take a little bit of time for people like me and you, people who buy shipping to feel the effects of this. But I think longer term, it's going to mean we pay less for shipping, and we're going to start shifting away from a price only game to a price plus service plus, innovation game, where the winner is going to be not just about the lowest price. It's not just have fast service, but can I have it really reliably?
Yes. Not 83% on time.
Yeah, something better than that. I think Truly in the high 90s. It needs to be in the high 90s for most e-commerce people. And customers just don't tolerate that anymore. They don't tolerate, well, I did my best to get it to you in 4 to 7 days. And sometimes you win some, you lose some. Customers do not care about that. And they're used to better service than that. And I think carriers are going to need to provide more certainty in the delivery window.
And that's interesting because incomes, and I say incomes, but a third national reputable carrier. And the reason I qualify that as income Daycom is Amazon. We all, Amazon's one of the best known brands in the world at this point. But I think what's unique now is the vast majority of that average daily volume that we're touting as number 2 in the market share right now is based off the Prime channel. It's the growth of Amazon Prime. But what I'm seeing is that they're making forays now outside of the Prime channel to compete with an Amazon, to compete with a UPS or a FedEx or USPS for that matter. I find that interesting and probably healthy, but how does one bring Amazon into the mix? And are there any potential concerns to consider on bringing Amazon in?
Yeah, as a person putting on my logistics only hat for a minute, I'm thrilled with having another option. I think about Amazon has been, looking at the end-to-end customer experience from day one. That's been a big part of their strategy all along. Not that the others haven't, but that seems to be a strength for them. And they're carrying their parcels end to end in most cases, so they're responsible for the whole journey. Whereas, UPS, FedEx they've got the work share programs and there's other subcontracting. But with Amazon as a logistics buyer, I think, hey, this could be a really good option for me. And they have so many classes of service. If I take my logistics hat off and I put my brand hat on, now I've got a few concerns, right? So anything that touches Amazon, you got to worry about, is this gonna become part of the Amazon? Amazon basics, let's say I'm doing some apparel, right? Am I going to see exactly what I'm doing today showing up on Amazon? My logistics guy would come in and say, don't worry about that, because unless you're on the marketplace or something on Amazon's marketplace, that's where you worry about that. I do think there's enough separation between church and state at Amazon where you've got the logistics service versus the merchant services, where you can use the Amazon logistics without too much fear of that. Maybe I'm being naive, but I kind of think that there's enough separation there that I would use their services. I would bring them in the mix. And so I'm kind of excited about what they're doing because we've needed a third player in the industry for a long time.
Yes, we have. I'm old enough to remember when there was a failed attempt at a third.
Yes.
It's not an easy endeavor. And I think there's a brand out there now that can pull it off. It is pulling it off, right? It's
hard to bet against Amazon at this point, right? Because they haven't had a lot of notable failures. They've been, right? They're dominating in pretty much everywhere they try. And so, my money is on, they're here to stay in the carrier business. They're going to, I think, provide a very valuable service for brands and retailers.
You bet. I agree. Given that, is there anything specific you have top of mind to think about some strategies for collaborating with Amazon and this kind of new market landscape?
You mean between on the retailer side?
On the retailer side, yeah, absolutely.
It's early days, kind of, so I'd like to see how they engage. I'm very familiar with how UPS and FedEx engage with their customers. What's interesting is, will Amazon treat competitors in the e-commerce space, but customers in the logistics space as if they have a voice in the product? If I'm a logistics buyer or a retailer and I want to use their services, I'm going to want to be able to give them some input. Is the product going to evolve towards an Amazon e-commerce perspective or sort of a broad merchandise, broad retailer perspective? So that's one thing that I'm kind of curious about. How much will they bring retailer input into the mix, their e-commerce retailer into the mix?
You'd mentioned earlier on in our conversation here, we're talking about other options. We're talking about going from potentially single sourcing to some sort of a multi-sourcing environment, right? Unwinding that ball of yarn, if you will, or you want to talk about golden handcuffs or whatever you want to call them with regard to kind of the terms and conditions that exist in those legacy things. You'd mentioned rate shopping down to the last package, right? To meet those thresholds, to get their attention. Any other tactics or strategies that you would recommend to consider when talking with a UPS or a FedEx and weaving in an Amazon logistics or a USPS where you normally weren't?
Nothing speaks quite as loudly as take moving volume or the threat of moving volume. And so I think actually having the ability to do that, even if you don't move it, is super important. So I think my first stop on my journey is always, do we have the technical flexibility to do that if we need to? Right, step one.
Yep, foundation of the house for sure.
Yeah, but that's no good if you don't also have the ability to sort of plan the supply chain a little bit. And so that means, do I have a network that can get me close to my customer? And do I know how to wield that network, right? And that means, do I have a technology stack that enables for effective network planning? And so I think in terms of how do I engage with the carriers, they're going to want to know, do I have the flexibility to manipulate my network to provide a good value to my customers on the website, or am I sort of locked into yesterday's technology and I don't really? I'm playing a bluff, basically, right? And so carriers know that they figure that stuff out, and so I think if you're not keeping up with the technology side, you just won't be able to have a strong conversation on that.
I agree. That's a tough one. I know of some clients even today, through acquisition and everything else, where they may be operating on 5 different EMS platforms. If you're the supply chain guy, that's a tough one to overcome.
And then that's sort of the adversarial view, but there's also a collaborative view. And I don't want to miss out on that, because it's just as important to me that we're pushing our partners in the carrier space to be a partner at the table and to talk about planning our business together. I've had many huge moments with carriers where it wasn't a rate conversation. It was just a joint collaboration about how I've said, hey, why don't you guys tell me what your suggestions are? You know what my goals are, right? I want to buck off my parcels and I want to deliver faster and I want better tracking and all the things, right? And why don't you guys come and talk to us about that? They will do that. They're really good at this. Sometimes there's untapped opportunities there. Well, they'll say, yeah, we don't know why you're line hauling it out to the edge when you could just, you could use our trucks, or, we already have a truck going there. Why don't we'll come pick it up? Or, we have programs that can help with cost reduction or returns reduction or whatever. And so I found that to be the first thing to do with my partners is like get their input. What would they recommend? And sometimes you get half of what you want just from that first conversation.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be gained to not take an adversarial approach. I'm a big proponent of trying to pull the carrier into the collaborative, consultative type of partnership role wherever possible. I think some of the challenges that we sometimes have, though, too, is the counter to that might be a view or a comment like, hey, aren't you letting the fox kind of guard the hen house now? How reliant are you on their analytics and their guidance, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a valid concern, right? How deep do you let them come in? But it doesn't cost much to get their ideas. And I think they already know what your parcels look like and they know where they're going. So, if I'm using UPS for 50% of my business, they know a lot about me already. And so just hearing from them, I think is a kind of a low cost way to make a lot of immediate progress. And sometimes I've learned things that I didn't know from my partners, where they're like, hey, you're shipping things in cartons that are if 2% larger than the volumetric threshold. If you had a slightly smaller carton, you'd save a lot of money. And I was like, man, we should have thought of that. That's something I remember that from my early years, and I never let that go after that. I was like, we're going to always check for that, make sure that that's part of our internal audit. So that's another thing too, right? Where almost everywhere I've been, we go to standardized cartons and we have our partners certify them so that they know, like if there's a overbilling, we know to a certainty, because we know which carton it was, that, hey, that's not oversized. That we know how much that's supposed to cost. Don't charge me more for it.
Do any tools or technologies come top of mind in your mind as you're thinking about this? You said you let out with, technology that can really help e-commerce shippers stay agile and responsive, kind of approach the market dynamically.
Yeah, I think there have been, obviously it kind of all starts with a good order management platform. I wouldn't even pick one particular one because it's so different by kind of sub industry. So you might get a better product for beauty and health than you would for apparel, for instance, because the dynamics of those businesses are slightly different. But I think in days past, Sterling Commerce with IBM was something that was really important. I think that's a platform that's pretty long in the tooth at this point, and there are other great platforms out there. Manhattan's got one. That's where I usually start in looking at the architectures. Do we have an adequate order management platform? And if not, that's what we got to do first. And then, like I mentioned, rate shopping. There's a number of good providers there. I love a model where you sort of let 1,000 flowers grow and you don't commit to anything too deeply. There's so much innovation, obviously, with AI right now that I wouldn't think it's a good idea to invest deeply in heavy platforms that try to do everything. And I like to see what's going to happen tomorrow. And maybe we swap out our rate shopping for something different. Maybe we have a new tracking solution. So I want technology that can easily connect to tomorrow's tech as well as just what we're using today, because there's just so much innovation happening right now.
So let's say for a minute, before I get us to the final thoughts, I think if we move from a legacy perspective, single sourcing or primarily single sourcing, to a more dynamic rate shopping environment where you have 3 or 4 options on the table that you're actively leveraging based off of cost and service and geography and those things. How do you manage the customer experience effectively in that environment?
There's no silver bullet. But
Amen.
the way that I think about that is you really need it to be designed. So I think about whether it's upstream supply chain or the outbound supply chain, it needs to be designed customer back. So what's the customer expect from me, from us? You force your systems and your processes to fit that, not the other way around. And so what that means is let's say I want to deliver a 2 to 3 day delivery experience to 97% reliability. I have decisions to make about technology, network design, how the work happens inside my buildings, how my 3PLs behave, where product is located. Because now I have to worry if I have a 5 DC network, am I going to split shipments and, sync my P&L, or am I going to wait to consolidate shipments, move things around? There's a lot of questions like that. So, but the boss here is, what's my customer expect of me? And so then we go back, and the problems are harder that way. Candidly, it's a lot easier to bring your problems to your customer and say, can you still love me? Than it is to say, The customer wants 3 days reliably. And so, well, we got hard work to do then, because we got to fix our tech, we got to fix our network, we got to change our work in the DCs, we got to plan our inventory better. There's a lot there. So there is no silver bullet, but having a clear picture for what's the vision for your customer experience, that's the starting point for it. And I think brands that do that and not the other way around are better off.
Man, that's a tough. I threw a tough one at you there. I know I did. There's a lot there. You got
the right question, though. It's the right question. Absolutely.
It gets your head spinning when you think about multiple DCs, and suddenly you have slow moving SKUs consolidated in one of those locations. The other 4 handle faster moving SKUs. My goodness, you could find yourself in a rate shopping environment where, if you're lucky enough to get all of the order on the doorstep on the same day, it might be delivered by 2 different carriers.
It could be, right? It could be. And some customers actually don't like that. They're going to say, hey, why am I getting 2 boxes on 2 different days? But I've found what you tell your customer helps a lot with what they expect of you, right? So if you're able to, if you know that you're going to ship in 2 boxes, for instance, just tell your customer, tell you this might be. Amazon does that really well. They say if you ship it, you can either have 2 boxes over 3 days, or you can have 1 box in 3 days. And I don't know what, how many select one versus the other, but you're just, then you set the expectation with the customer, what's going to happen. And it's as simple as your systems need to know that, so that you can tell your customer what your plan is, what the fulfillment plan is, and message it clearly, and then deliver against that. Sounds easy, and it's not easy, of course. It's very hard to do, but I don't know how to do it other than articulate what my customer expects of me and bend everything around that. And obviously there's a limit. I'm not going to deliver in 8 days. It needs to be probably 3, probably doesn't need to be 2. I don't know, like for 90% of my customers, but depends on the business, but figure out what that is and then message it and deliver against it.
Yeah. And I liked what you said too. Allow the customer to decide, right?
Yeah. Right. It's a huge point, because they can decide, I want to go faster, so I'm going to pay a little bit for that. I want it in 1 box, or it's okay if it's in 2 boxes, whatever. And that having their agency involved at the point of checkout takes a lot of the problems out of fulfillment.
If we get to the final thoughts here, I've grabbed a bunch of your time, and you've been very helpful, and I think sharing your perspective has been very valuable. You were to offer final tips to the listener group out here, help them navigate these challenging, very dynamic times in e-commerce shipping, what would you encapsulate that to?
What I think about most right now is the shifting market, which I do feel is in favor of buyers right now. And so, first thing I'd be doing as a brand or retailer is getting my data together and figuring out what do I think the market can support here in terms of pricing, because and be aggressive about it. I would say, if you haven't negotiated your contracts in 5+ years, start aggressive and think, is there $1 per parcel? Is there more than $1 per parcel I could save through re-looking at everything? So I think that's number one. There's price out there to be had for brands and retailers. And I think don't wait till your contract's up. Start having that conversation today, because the market's already changing. Second thing I would say is expect that the future, don't let our carriers win just on price, because there's going to be an explosion in innovation. There already is. And, the routing of parcels is going to get better, which is going to lead to better tracking, better visibility, more reliable delivery. And I think you want to see that. Make them show you that, because they're working on that. And if you can say to your customer, I'm going to give you a date certain for delivery instead of a range, for instance, That's a pretty important thing. So those are the big things on my mind right now is like, how do you, as a brand or retailer, make sure you're getting the pricing that you need? Don't wait till the contract's up. And then make sure you're also making your carriers, your partners compete for the innovation that they provide to your customer as well.
Great closing remarks. Jamin, how can our listeners contact you or connect with you if they'd like?
Sure. Well, you can reach me. My website is jd-advisory.com. My name is Jamin, and it's Jamin at jd-advisory.com.
Excellent. It's been a lot of fun. I look forward to future conversations with you, Jamin. To our listeners, I thank you again for listening to another episode. And I look forward to bringing more, I think, timely, relevant topics for your benefit in the future. Take care.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks for listening to Parcel Perspectives, hosted by me, Glenn Gooding. I've been in the small parcel space for 37 years, starting with a deep and broad background working for one of the major carriers as an operator and industrial engineer, later managing pricing at the highest level for the largest, most complex shippers in the world. Since then, I've been a national thought leader and worked to help drive strategy for clients from Fortune 50 companies to startup e-commerce businesses, helping them more competitively align in this complex and expensive market. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and share with friends. Join us next time for more expert advice and strategies to stay ahead of the shipping game.